Good evening, everyone. In our fast-paced world, it is rare to witness the dedication of an artist to a project of many years. Michael O'Keeffe spent 3 years making 50 large graphite drawings in conversation with the Parthenon relief sculptures of the British Museum, and another year documenting the project in the beautifully designed catalog that is available here tonight. Paris-based art historian Stephanie Nadalo contributed an essay to the catalog and writes eloquently about O'Keeffe's fresh pictorial language that thrives independently from his ancient sources. A selection of these drawings is on view at Valley House Gallery through Saturday and will be available for viewing after the exhibition closes. Valley House has represented O'Keeffe's drawings, sculpture, and paintings since 2009. Michael O'Keeffe came to Dallas from the Northeast. What a faux pas.
Yeah.
To study at SMU and received his MFA in 2006. He received his BFA at Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and did further study at the Maryland Institute, the International School in Umbria, and the New York Studio School. He decided early in his career to focus on the figure. When you visit Valley House, you will see many of his figurative sculptures in the garden. In 2013, 10 years ago, he founded the O'Keeffe Studio Center on Arapahoe Road in Richardson, an independent teaching space for arts education of all artistic backgrounds for those of you who would like to take classes. Please silence your cell phones now as we are recording this. Michael will be answering questions after his talk and will be available to autograph the catalog. Thank you all for being here.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. It's quite an honor. It always is an honor to have an opportunity to talk about my work, and it's especially wonderful to have this many people here to listen to my thoughts. I want to thank Cheryl Vogel and Kevin Vogel, as well as Laura Green, who's here somewhere tonight, all from Valley House Gallery, for all the work they've done to help promote this project. And that includes tonight. It includes the exhibition that's at Valley House currently, and it includes their contribution to the beautiful book that we made. Thank you to the Meadows Museum for allowing us to do this here. And although she's not here, I'd also like to thank the brilliant art historian Stephanie Nadalo for the wonderful essay that she made. It's an important part of the book. Between the year 2018 and the year 2021, I worked on a series of 50 drawings that I refer to as Conversations with Ancient Stones. Some of you have seen the exhibition at Valley House Gallery, and so you've gotten a sense of the project, a partial sense of the project. Some of you have seen my many social media posts over the years, and so you might have a sense of the project in that regard. But very few of you have heard a thorough summary of my layered intentions and interests regarding this project. It is with many layers, this project. There's no tidy conceptual framework for this project. In fact, I've referred to this project as a bubbling cauldron of contradictions and countervailing forces. So tonight I hope to peel back some of those layers so that you can better relate to these drawings. The first thing I'd like you to consider is that in my formative years, in my early 20s, I spent hundreds of hours drawing in museums. I stood in front of works of art that were compelling to me, and in a sense, I asked the artist to reveal to me something of what made their work of art so compelling. These were conversational drawings. They were rather one-sided conversational drawings in the sense that I did not assert myself very much. I did not impose my imagination on these works of art. I did not reinterpret these works of art. I mostly just listened to what the artists had to share with me by way of their work of art. And this is all to say that from a very early age, it's a very familiar thing to me to spend time in conversation with historical works of art. One of the many things I learned while drawing in museums years ago was the notion that in the world of art, a crane is never just a crane, a lion is never just a lion, fabric is never just fabric, hands are never just hands, and so on and so on. For me, art exists in a world of symbolism and metaphor. When I make art, when I look at art, I find that I'm always engaged in this way. And that's how I'd like you to engage with my drawings. Another thing I'd like you to consider is that as long as I've worked at art, I've made both drawings and sculptures. I've worked equally in these two disciplines. A number of people have asked me, if you were conversing with relief sculptures, how come you didn't respond to what you were looking at in the language of relief sculpture? The main reason why I use drawing as the way to engage with these ancient stones is because it's a more nimble art form. It allows me to move more easily through the process of conversing and imagining possibilities. But there's also the fact that for me, it's a very natural thing to move back and forth between drawing and sculpture, between sculpture and drawing, and the two languages inform each other. And so it's very comfortable for me to think about the crossover here. Many years before I began drawing in art museums, many years before I even had the idea that I might like to work as an artist, I had a profound experience in a museum. I was a teenager traveling through Europe with the youth basketball team, and to his credit, my coach made us go to the British Museum of Art when we were in London. I have a vague memory that has stuck with me all of these years of walking into this gallery. It's the gallery at the British Museum of Art that houses many of the sections of the Parthenon frieze. Perhaps it was the beautiful light that struck me that day when I was a kid. Perhaps it was the beautiful space. Perhaps it was the epic length of the Parthenon frieze wrapping around this beautiful space. In any case, that memory stuck with me. And so 25 years later, in 2018, when I returned to London, I was excited to revisit the British Museum of Art and to re-examine the sections of the Parthenon frieze that are housed there. After only a short while of interacting with these relief sculptures, I found myself even more thrilled than I imagined. The light was still beautiful, and the length of the relief was still epic as it wrapped around the beautiful space. But it was something else that thrilled me. Like many ancient sculptures, the sections of the Parthenon frieze at the British Museum are very much damaged and weathered. The way in which these particular ancient stones were damaged and weathered was especially interesting to me. There was still a certain amount of evidence of the ancient Greek artistic aesthetic, but that aesthetic is interrupted in very surprising and beautiful ways. The organic shapes, textures, and lines of the broken stones opened up the narrative of the relief sculptures in ways that made for a visual playground. It made for very fertile ground for my imagination. Before I say more about the drawings that grew out of that fertile ground, I want to give a little bit of a context for the Parthenon frieze. This is an illustration of the Parthenon as it once was. So up under the ceiling, above the second row of columns on the Parthenon, was the Parthenon frieze. It was a continuous narrative of relief sculpture that wrapped all the way around this building. And many of the sections of the Parthenon frieze no longer exist. There are just over 100 sections of stone that made up this continuous relief that still exist, and by my count, about 56 of those sections of stone exist at the British Museum of Art. There's another 47 or so that exist at the Acropolis Museum in Athens. The Parthenon relief was 3 feet 4 inches tall, and on average, the sections of stone that it was carved from were 5 feet 9 inches long, or wide rather. So for practical reasons, the sculptors that worked on this relief sculpture worked on, although it was a continuous narrative, it was carved out of sections of stone, most likely because it's easier to hoist up 48 feet in the air there. I'm going to read a bit from Stephanie's essay. Stephanie writes, "The Parthenon, built on the Acropolis in Athens, a city that is considered the cradle of Western civilization, was perhaps the greatest artistic achievement of the classical period of ancient Greece. The construction of the building and all the sculptures within was carried out under the direction of the great Phidias during the height of classical Greek artistic achievement. The relief sculptures from the Parthenon frieze were, in a sense, the crown atop the greatest classical Greek pagan temple. The sections of the Parthenon frieze that inspired my drawings were originally the crown atop the greatest of Greek temples made by the greatest of Greek sculptors, located at the center of the cradle of Western civilization. These facts should be kept in mind when considering the drawings that I made. But the Parthenon and all the sculptures that once adorned the structure no longer look like this. The damage and decay of 2,500 years of history should be kept in mind as well. A few more thoughts about this combination of a very particular point of origin and the long history between now and then. The construction of the Parthenon occurred during the life of Socrates, was finished 3 years before the birth of Plato, and not long before the birth of Aristotle. Around the same time that the ancient stones that influenced my drawings were born, these great philosophers were walking the earth and forming the ideas that have made a profound impact on human civilization. Many ideas that originated with these philosophers are still present in the way we think and live today, and many of the conflicts that we are currently sorting out in our contemporary culture are argued in Platonic or Aristotelian terms. This is not to say that there is some direct connection between the relief sculptures from the Parthenon and these philosophers, but they all share this original point in time, and therefore they are at least symbolically connected. And then there is the damage and decay that points to the long history that the stones have lived. Originally a pagan temple, the Parthenon moved through various evolutions, from a Christian church to a Catholic cathedral, to a Muslim mosque, to a dormant historical entity, to a 17th century munitions storehouse, and finally to an iconic ruin. These evolutions weathered the stones and changed the images. The damage and decay that overlays the ancient Greek aesthetic speaks to time, history, change, evolutions of culture, evolutions of religion, evolutions of power dynamics, the struggles and triumphs of many wars, and the problematics of colonialism. So, because my drawings grow out of a conversation with sections of the Parthenon frieze, they are necessarily tied to this thing we know of as Western civilization. Back in 2018, when I conceived of this project, I thought this would be an interesting way to reflect on this history, comment on this history, and place the viewer in a situation where they were asked to do the same. The 2,500 years that the sections of the Parthenon frieze have lived is a long and complicated history. So I never intended to touch on everything, every landmark, every concern. It was more a general means of reflection. By the way, if you see writing on the screen without quotations, they're excerpts from my introduction that's part of the book. I've also included lots of excerpts from Stephanie's essay, and in that case, you'll see quotations in her name next to it. My drawings are narrative. They are meant to tell stories. The Parthenon frieze originally told a very specific story. I'm not especially interested in the original story of the Parthenon frieze, but if nothing else, it'll help you understand why there's so many damn horses in my drawings. The Parthenon frieze originally told the story of the Pantheonaic procession, which was an annual parade of sorts that celebrated the birth of Athena. And the relief sculpture, which encompasses this section of the Parthenon, you see the red line up there, it started on the east wall, and you can see in the beginning you see military individuals and horse and riders that move in both directions along the north and the south walls, and there are charioteers, and then there are individuals leading beasts to be sacrificed, and then there are maidens bringing gifts for Athena, and all of this procession around both long sides culminates in on the east side of the Parthenon, where there sits images of Greek gods and other heroes of ancient Athenian myth. I am not especially interested in the story of the Pantheonaic procession, other than the way that a certain amount of residue from this ancient narrative evokes a sense of the cradle of Western civilization. My drawings are meant to tell stories that are as much in the interest of the present day as they are in the interest of historical times. And you must remember that for me, a horse is never just a horse. So, back to this moment in 2018. I was in the British Museum of Art, standing in front of a work of art that was compelling to me. I was using drawing as an active way to look, as a way to converse with a historical work of art. I found this particular ancient stone compelling because of the weathered and damaged surfaces that interrupted the classical narrative and opened up the situation in a way that allowed me in. It was in this moment that I decided I wanted to spend some time with these relief sculptures. I decided right then that I wanted to have a conversation in the form of drawing with each section of the Parthenon frieze that I saw in the museum that day. Did Lynn Baskin make it tonight? Is Lynn here? I was hoping Lynn would make it, but she's had some health issues, and Lynn was with me on the trip to London. Me and Juliet McCullough, my artist friend Juliet, we took a group of students to London to visit various museums, and Lynn was sitting in the gallery while I was making this drawing. This is the drawing that I was making at that moment that she took this photo. And it was a very propitious thing that she took this photo because it documented this important moment. So that day I left the museum with a lot of excitement. I was thrilled by this idea that I was going to commit some time. I had no idea it would be as much time as it turned out being, but I was going to commit some time to making drawings from all of these beautiful stones. And later that night, as I continued to think about this project, I had bumping around in my mind some vague remembrance of a line from a Rilke poem, something about the awakening of sleeping stones. And so I Googled it up, and I found, I was reminded of the first stanza of Rilke's poem, Remembrance. And you can see here that on my little sketch, I even wrote down the poem because it was part of the sort of original conception of this project. The first stanza of this poem says, "And you wait, keep waiting for that one thing which would infinitely enrich your life, the powerful, the unique and uncommon, the awakening of sleeping stones, depths that would reveal you to yourself." And so this poem resonated with me. I wanted to make powerful drawings. I wanted to make unique and uncommon images. And I wanted to have a conversation with these stones that, in a sense, woke them up for me and also woke something up in myself. I wanted to make drawings that revealed something of myself to me, and ideally I wanted my drawings to create the potential to reveal something to the viewer. I needed to get images of these stones because it was not reasonable for me to move to London and draw in the museum for hundreds and hundreds of hours. So at the risk of missing my flight on the day that I was leaving London, I hustled to the museum And I took photographs of each section of the Parthenon frieze that is located there. And I brought these photographs back to Dallas. I printed them out at a scale that I could engage with. And I hung them up in my studio. And I began to draw. And I began with, I don't know if you can see down here, this is my more complete drawing, not my sketch, but my more complete drawing. I started with the same stone that I was drawing from here. And I worked my way down the line until at a certain point it made sense to me to sort of shift my approach. Basically, I got tired of drawing everything facing the right side of my paper. So I jumped to the south side of the Parthenon and started drawing some images that faced the other way and then back and forth. So I'm going to go through a number of drawings now, and the format that I'll use here is much like what's in the book, where the drawing is on the right, the stone is on the left. So you can hopefully see the ways in which I referred to the stones directly, the ways in which I departed from the stones. And, you know, I could spend a lot of time talking about any one of these drawings, and we could spend twice as much time if I invited all of you to share what you see and what you think, which is what part of me is inclined to do. But I think, you know, I'm going to just keep moving through a number of these drawings and share little bits of my feelings about them. But if at any point you have a question or an observation, please feel free to raise your hand or just shout it out and join the conversation, if you will. My drawings point to fundamental myths, but in ways that overlap narratives of past, present, and future, presenting a bubbling cauldron of contradictions and countervailing forces. There is the full line there that I was referring to earlier. You know, part of the story that I'm trying to tell is a story of contradictions and countervailing forces. So, you know, you can see that this horse in the stone has its skin on its body. But just to give you an idea of the way I engaged with these drawings or these stones in terms of imagination, this little bit of damage right here on the rump of the horse, it reminded me of one of those things we've seen where they're operating on someone and some skin is pulled back and you see inside the body. And so that sort of prompted me, in the context of everything else that I was thinking about with the narrative that I was creating, it made sense to me to draw the horse in this case in such a way that we see the anatomy that's underneath the surface. I won't explain to you the symbology of that or the sort of poetics of that for me. And, you know, these drawings are intentionally cryptic. I like it that way. And you can see some of the other things that, you know, like there is no figure here at all. It's just a horse. And there's, you know, this shape, which was the shoulder and the chest of the horse, became the rump of this figure here. So Stephanie writes, collectively, the series questions the limits of visual legibility and forecloses the notion that any image can communicate a singular, coherent meaning. This is one of the things that Stephanie picked up on that I'm so grateful for. You know, she gave words to something that was clearly part of my intentions. So the way this conversation went, the stones presented this shape to me. And then my response to that was, what about an owl? An owl is an interesting symbol, and my imagination ran from there. Besides, I had never drawn an owl, and that was pretty exciting to imagine too. But, you know, the owl is a symbol that, you know, everyone today thinks of an owl as symbolizing wisdom or self-actualization. And in ancient times, an owl was actually a symbol of death. And so I loved the conflict here or not necessarily the conflict, but the sort of countervailing forces, if you will. After 2,500 years of damage and decay, the stones combine hints of wonderful examples of classical Greek artistic schema with a remarkably beautiful patina of time. But could it be that the damage and changes to these objects helps them to tell a more complete and rich story? A story that acknowledges a multidimensional history and a story that is still becoming. This drawing here, everyone who looks at this drawing is going to see the weeping unicorn, and they're going to make of that what they will. But I want to spill the beans on a symbolic element that I packed into this drawing, and there's lots of examples of this type of sort of embedded reference in many of these drawings. But I wanted to kind of give you an example of the types of things that my imagination was inclined to pack into these drawings. So this figure here, leading the way, it occurred to me to very subtly and quietly reference this very famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. So you can see that in the head and the hat and the collar, there's a whisper of this painting, and you see it in the sword and the sash as well. So this is the way my imagination works. These are the types of stories I like to build. They have many layers. Each drawing is as much representation as it is projection, as much a declaration as it is an appeal, as much metaphor as it is historical reference, and as much in the interest of present days as it is in the interest of history. I'll buy anyone dinner if they see the art historical reference, except Barnaby. If anyone else besides Barnaby sees the art historical reference, I'll buy you dinner. See me afterwards if you see it. In any case, you can see here that the horses disappeared and became just some sort of rhythmic movement of shapes. The wheel here that was part of some chariot it still remains a wheel, but it's also a globe, it's also a clock. And this broken section here, the edge of the stone, which leaves this empty space, became a curtain that's pulled back to reveal the narrative. I have found that the influence that the stones have had on my imagination is just as great as the influence my imagination has had on the drawings. This push and pull between myself and the ancient stones allowed me to approach important themes in new ways. Again, to give you a little window into the narrative here, this little broken corner down here prompted me to make this little cave down here in my drawing. And for me, this is a little quiet reference to Plato's allegory of the cave. And so this little figure standing here with his shadow looking at the light there outside the cave, it's a subtle way to evoke a sense of that narrative, and then one has to consider that narrative as it relates to the rest of the image, to the rest of the symbols, to the rest of the objects. Like a modern-day Phidias, O'Keeffe is a skilled draftsman and sculptor who is adept at translating the three-dimensional qualities of stone to the flat surface of paper. Moreover, the series highlights his willingness to experiment with different drawing techniques to produce a range of effects. My first responsibility, I felt, when making these drawings, was to make beautiful drawings. It was to make commanding drawings and to do so, I employed a whole range of drawing techniques. This project, one of the joys of this project is it allowed me to indulge in all sorts of drawing approaches, everything from a more frenetic mark-making a zone of frenetic mark making, to a zone that has its own sort of gestural qualities because of the erasure marks, to these areas of dense patterning, which were fun to make until they weren't. A certain number of hours into, this is blown up on the screen, so it looks more reasonable at this scale to make all of these little shapes and then go in and push some depth around these organic forms. But at the scale that it actually exists, it's a little bit intense. And then I also engaged with ways of drawing that were more in like a hyper-realist kind of language. And this drawing here depicts the type of pencil that I used, 90% of the time I used these dumb little Papermate pencils, and they have very good erasers, and I don't have to sharpen them. And so that's why I use those pencils. So I'm going to show a few videos that will give you a sense of the way I build these drawings. These are videos that I had stored away from social media posts. I didn't know I'd be using them for this purpose, but you get a sense of the way I build my values. There's some shading in these drawings, but mostly I'm using a hatching technique or a cross-hatching technique. And so you can sort of see the pace with which these drawings were made. And it's a pretty slow pace. And I don't just work this way to torture myself. I find that the value structure that I can build this way is best. I sort of take the whole drawing along. Obviously, some parts get ahead of others, but I'm slowly working towards a value structure that is beautiful and is complete. And this pace also allows for a nice pace for reflection and contemplation, which was part of this project as well. Here's another video that's sped up, and so you get a little bit of a better sense of the changes being made. It's not a snail's pace in this case. In this slide, on the right is the drawing as it exists in its finished state. I will say that this auditorium is beautiful, this projector is beautiful, but it does overblow my values a little bit. And so that's a little bit tough to swallow. I spend so much time making these really subtle value shifts, and the projector, I don't know if it's the sort of glow of the whole thing or if it's just the contrast, but it does overblow things a little bit. So I think if you've gone to see the drawings at the gallery or even in the book, you can tell that there's a greater degree of subtlety to my values. And again, that's important to me because it's important that these drawings be beautiful. But in any case, I think this video helps you see the complexity of the value construction. Let's look at another video. This video gives you a sense of a more complete section of a drawing alongside a more unfinished section of a drawing, so that you can get a feeling for the way I would begin these drawings. This happens to be the last drawing I made in the series, and it's the only drawing that I've worked on from left to right. Normally, I work all over and build the whole drawing up at the same time, sort of all at once. I knew from the beginning what I wanted the image to be with this drawing, which was unusual. All of the other drawings kind of unfolded over time. There was a lot of trial and error, false starts and the like, and I didn't know what I was going to find until I found it. The images generally came to be over time and slowly. But with this drawing, the final drawing, I knew what I wanted to do, and so I indulged in working left to right so that as I built all of these values, I didn't have to worry about smudges. When doing this sort of subtle cross-hatching, as soon as your hand brushes against the hatch marks, it causes a bruise of sorts. I was able to spare myself the pain of dealing with that issue in this drawing. So anyway, the point here is that you can see this type of sketching that I used initially with all of these drawings. I put the photograph on my drawing table next to a blank piece of paper, and I would begin sketching. In some moments drawing exactly what I saw in the stone, and in other moments asserting my imagination. At first really rough and vague, and then as I start to discover the figures and forms, I slowly give them more definition, and then I start to plug in values and everything starts to come to the surface from there. I'd like to show one more video. A lot of these drawings have areas where the directionality of my hatch marks is very specific. So you can see here at the top of this drawing where the heads kind of fade into the mountain range, all of the hatch marks there are horizontal. And that's to reinforce the sense of the horizon line in the deep space. There are drawings where the directionality of the hatch marks are diagonal or vertical or a particular pattern. And it is always specific to some aspect of the composition that I'm building or the story that I'm telling. And so with this video, I just wanted to give you a sense of the drawing vocabulary. Stephanie writes, by undermining the logic of perspectival space and asserting his own physical presence into the drawing by reminding us of the tools he used to create the series, O'Keeffe highlights the artifice of visual art and reminds us that the act of drawing is itself an act of creation. Space is a character in this series of drawings. The picture plane, meaning the place where we enter the drawing, in a sense we enter these drawings at the edge of the page, but I've got this frame around the images in every case, and sometimes the drawing spills out beyond the frame. But there's enough evidence of this frame that it evokes this sense of the picture plane. And sometimes I very intentionally put objects in our space in front of the picture plane. So in this piece on the lower right, I put my pencil and my clip and my pear in the space that traditionally is talked about as being our space, outside of the picture plane, versus within the imagined space. And this horse in that same drawing is existing just on our side of the space of the drawing. In the drawing on the lower left, you can see the cruciform that the figure steps over, and that cruciform is interrupting the threshold of the picture plane. Also, that figure that is stepping over the cross is pulling back what reads as a curtain, but which is also the frame that establishes the picture plane. So many of these drawings use space as a character, and it's used in different ways, but it's an important idea for me. It is a theme I would want the viewer to engage with as they experience these drawings. Looking closer at this particular drawing, I want to consider the notion that the most common way I use space in this series is to create an impossible or conflicted environment. So with this drawing here, you can see that I've got these foreground objects, including this horse and rider, and so the aim is for the viewer to ask themselves, if that's the scale of the pear and the pencil, and they are just about the same point in space as this horse and rider, well then, what is this horse and rider? If not a literal person, what does it represent? What is it about that scale? And then you have the scale of this little sailboat back here in the water, and there is this figure on the left that stands in the water at just about the same point in space as the boat, and yet the background figure is bigger than the foreground figure. And that background figure waiting in the water is holding a line that literally is the horizon line, which is supposed to be the deepest point in space. And the foreground figure is similarly holding lines, but these lines are conventional perspective lines that converge as they move back in space, taking us all the way back to the lighthouse in the deep space. And then even deeper in space than the lighthouse, here on the right, is the additional figure who is about the same scale as the figure that holds the horizon line. And so you can see that I'm intentionally setting a space that is hard to come to terms with, a space that bubbles with contradictions and countervailing forces. That's part of the story. And it is also about forcing the viewer into a mindset where they think in terms of symbolism. And you can see when you look at the ancient stone, the two figures that I push back in space are intended to be riding horses right up in the front space. But in my drawing, one can still see the horses' heads They are very quietly embedded in this landmass rising up on the horizon. I want to show you some other themes that are found throughout the project, including some other examples of way in which I use space as a character. In the case of these drawings, there's this sort of edge-of-the-world threshold. In the drawing on the lower right, the standing figure stands at the edge of this shallow space on this sort of deck, and then the blank paper becomes a void that the figure is looking down into. And this horse is sort of tenderly resting his head against his back, maybe nudging the figure off the edge, maybe not. But that horse with the tender face is being ridden by this figure that has a sort of vexed expression on their face, and their hands are clenched in this sort of maniacal way. And then the other horse is whispering in the ear of the vexed rider. And then the viewer might mix in the energy of these lines to the right, and altogether there is a sort of tension of a moment at the edge of something. Looking now at the drawing on the lower left, you can see once again the theme of precariousness. In the drawing, this ball sits at the very edge of the ground plane line, while this whole mass of form and line and texture balances on another similar sphere. So as the one figure prepares to cast a stone at the other figure, the whole situation kind of teeters. Above on the left, this raging bull is being led by a character who's directing the bull into the abyss, off the edge, off the page, but also over the edge of the form I drew under the figures. There's this poor individual that is trying to slow down the inevitable. He's all tangled up in the rope that is tied to the bull's horns, but we know what's going to happen there. And the drawing in the upper right was the next drawing that I made in the series. As I engaged with the next stone, I thought, well, if the characters from the previous drawing in the series are going off the edge, then I'm going to have these figures come up out of the abyss. Space is a character in my drawings. Here we see another theme that is found throughout these drawings, this dense network of shapes. They are generally shapes that can be found throughout these drawings. They are horses' legs and hooves, human legs and feet, and in some cases, not seen here, other parts of the figures or various other nondescript forms. I made various stencils from parts of certain drawings, and I used the stencils throughout other drawings to create these complex pockets of shapes that become these ambiguous forms. The figures of these drawings interact with these forms in various ways. They are lodged in the ambiguous form, or fighting through the ambiguous form, or they are stuck in the ambiguous form, and yet they are typically part of the ambiguous form. Circles. Generally, I love circles. Circles are a character in these drawings. A less ambiguous shape, but one that is also loaded with various possibilities in terms of symbolism. A circle means different things depending on the context. In the drawing on the upper left, just to describe the obvious, the figure on the right is standing on this wheel, and the wheel is sort of being halted by this figure who's leaning on the wheel and shoving the figure back. The falling figure has their balance stick, but they're going backwards. Except for the fact that embedded in the dark form that is behind the figures is another figure that seems to lean into the falling figure, giving some sense of support. That figure seems to be the only thing keeping the figure from falling backwards. Or are they going to succeed in keeping them from falling? So in this section of the Parthenon marbles, you can see this shape that exists as part of this figure's head. It was not carved this way. It is a section of the carving that was damaged at some point over the long history of the life of the stone. And it was that shape that began the unfolding of the narrative that took form in my drawing. It prompted me to think of a piece of fabric covering the figure's eyes, and so I began to imagine this idea of the blind leading the blind. And so the horse needed to be blindfolded as well. Also, you can see this V-shaped section of the stone that is missing that leads into a vertical crack in the stone. These features of the stone gave rise in my drawing to the space behind this sort of wall where I put a setting sun, and the contrast there sort of accentuates the expression on the horse's mouth. And the light pours down into the crack, transitioning to darkness as it leads the eye of the viewer to the front hoof of the horse. And then there is this section of different colored stone, sort of a darker and cooler color. Originally, these sculptures were painted with these intense and I think terrible colors that made it probably very hard to see the beautiful carving. So this piece of stone, I don't know if it was a repair job that makes it a different color or if it was just under different conditions for some period of time, but it's a different color. And so I used that shape in my drawing as something of a pedestal for this hand, a way to emphasize this hand, a hand which isn't even in the original stone, but it became the hand for the closest of these characters that I found in the shapes and textures on the right side of the ancient stone. I was very pleased that at the reception at Valley House, many people came up to me and told me that they appreciated the sense of humor they saw in many of these drawings. Although all of these drawings are dead serious, and in many cases meant to be anything but funny, there are moments where I incorporate a certain amount of a sense of humor. This is one of the drawings that was clearly meant to have an aspect of humor. This beefcake character on the left, he's riding a carousel horse, at least that's what I'm intending for you to think of. And he's kind of making the classic flex pose of the macho man, and yet he has this sort of pathetic forearm and withered hand. And he's looking back at his buddy who is holding some balloons and is also riding a horse. But this horse is sort of a negative space horse with wobbly legs. All of these narrative aspects of my drawing are prompted by something I find in the ancient stones. Or maybe these aspects are awakened in me by something in the ancient stones. As I go through these various drawings, I've tried to share with you a little bit of the way I understand them. Although it's very important to me that you have your own way of seeing and understanding the drawings. And I don't want to say too much because then it influences you a little bit too much. But my experience is that people enjoy hearing at least a little bit about how I, the artist, sees the work. This drawing started with this form here on the right of the section of stone, the form which is, of course, a result of time, damage, and decay. It seems to be sitting on the bull's head. You don't completely see the bull's head, but you kind of feel the gesture of the head. And it's like the head is collapsing under the weight of that shape. And so that gesture, that idea, becomes sort of an illustration of an oppressive thing. And so I ran with that idea. That bull and his human friend here in my drawing became a version of the idea where they are both loaded down by all of these forms that are strapped to them. And they exist in this space behind the wall. All of the feet are sharing the same plane along with the wall, but the clear overlap at the same time separates them in space. And then in front of the wall is this character that is scratching his head, and he has this sort of pathetic look on his face. I forget how I came up with this part of the image, but this bull has this goofy bonnet of botanical stuff on his head and a wreath around his neck. And so for me, this drawing became a narrative of the oppressed and the oppressor, with the wall being this thing that separates these figures, and yet, like in all of my drawings, they all stand on the same picture plane. So again, playing with pictorial space becomes a mean to add layers to the narrative, and they are in different spaces, but they're sharing the same footing. Stephanie writes, by exploring the poetics of stone fragments and dematerialization of form, O'Keeffe offers a meditation on the nature of impermanence and the paradox of time. Just as the Parthenon marbles continue to accrue new meaning in our present day, this drawing series transcends its moment of creation and remains suspended in an open-ended conversation wherein you, the viewer, participate in the unfolding story. That sums it up pretty nicely, including my desire that the viewer engage with these narratives and participate in the unfolding story. These images are meant to be loaded up with potent symbolism for you to piece together and make sense of in your own way. This drawing is how I ended the project, number 50. I originally was going to make a conversational drawing with every section of the Parthenon relief at the British Museum, and then I was going to go to Athens and I was going to take photographs and make a drawing of every section of the relief sculpture there. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, COVID killed my trip to Greece, and so things got more reasonable in terms of the scope of the project. In the end, I even edited about 6 of the drawings that I thought were less part of the group, and I ended up with 50 drawings. And I ended with these 2 figures that are actually from 2 different stone fragments that aren't even next to each other. But I just needed some way to end the whole thing. And so these 2 figures clearly evoke the classical with their garments. And without saying too much, the figure on the left holds a string that tugs the figure on the right towards him. And the figure on the right holds the missing pieces to this figure on the left. And so I'll leave you with that.